Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Intro to Business, as we continue this look at content from Module 8 having to do with leadership. Now, specifically what we're looking at is the whole topic of leading people, and therefore the first premise would be, in order to lead people well and effectively, you have to understand people and what makes them tick. And so in this particular module, what we're looking at in this video is the whole topic of people and personality. It's a fascinating topic, your employees' personality and how that will affect their effectiveness at work, as well as your own effectiveness at work. So let's dive right in. Now, when you look at the topic of personality, as you can see from the slide in front of you, let's first take a minute to define our terms. Generally speaking, behavioral psychologists will define personality as the relatively stable set of psychological attributes that distinguish one person from another. That's a fascinating way to look at personality. Personality, therefore, being defined as the relatively stable set of attributes or habitual behaviors that define one person versus another person and their particular set of attributes, behaviors, habitual responses to stimuli in the environment, and those kinds of things. One of the first things that was suggested was that personality was really made up of a matrix of 5 personality traits, and you can see them there defined by this particular graphic. The 5 personality traits there you can see: agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotionality, extroversion, and openness. What's suggested by this graphic, as you can tell here, by the way on the left hand, what is lauded is high agreeableness, high conscientiousness, more positive emotionality, more extroversion, and more openness, is that those traits would be more desirable in a potential employee, in a candidate for a particular role, than the set of attributes on the right-hand side of the spectra. In other words, it would be less desirable to identify a candidate and potentially hire a candidate with low agreeableness, low conscientiousness, more negative emotionality, more introversion, and less openness. Now, before we are able to consider whether or not this conclusion is accurate, let's define our terms. So the textbook will define agreeableness as a person's ability to get along with others, or perhaps the ability or the tendency of someone to be able to play well with others in the same sandbox. The second trait of conscientiousness is defined as a reflection of the number of things a person tries to accomplish. Can a person conscientiously accomplish many different things, or are they really only good at a few? Emotionality is defined as the degree to which people tend to be positive or negative in their outlook and behaviors towards others. Moving along then to attributes 4 and 5, extroversion is defined as a person's comfort level with relationships, whereas openness is defined as it reflects on how open or rigid a person is in terms of his or her beliefs. And so if we move back to consider the graph that we had originally looked at, you can see how in those terms then it is suggested, at least historically, that when we consider personality as being made up of these 5 personality traits, these traits don't change very much, and it is more attractive of a candidate or potential hire to be high in agreeableness, high in conscientiousness, to have more positive emotionality, to have greater levels of extroversion, and to be more open. Now, before we just simply accept that at face value, what I ask you to consider though, if we look back at these definitions, for instance, at openness, is it always true that for every potential hire role, that a higher degree of openness is more attractive for a candidate? That is desirable to hire someone who is more open in terms of his or her beliefs. Is that always the case? Consider for a moment, if you are hiring someone for the position of your chief accountant, typically in a public corporation known as the controller, Is it wise and is it desirable to have a controller who is more open? In other words, going back to this definition, someone who is open and not rigid in terms of his or her beliefs, particularly as an accountant in terms of what is right and wrong, how strict should we adhere, for instance, to the rules of accountancy known these days in public accountancy as Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. Do we really want someone who is not rigid in their beliefs on these kinds of things? And so simply my suggestion would be that if we take personality as a somewhat durable set of 5 personality traits that don't change, that really, you can't really say that in every single case, for every particular role, and in every circumstance, that an employee or a candidate who tends towards the left side of this spectrum is always more desirable than someone who tends to the right end of the spectrum. Now, I think that in advance or a way forward through their understanding of personality as simply these 5 immovable traits might be demonstrated by this next consideration that the textbook provides, which is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, which was at one time, particularly back in the early 80s, a popular questionnaire that some organizations would use to assess personality types at the point of candidacy when you apply for a job, and therefore to try to thumbnail an estimate of whether or not you are well suited to a particular role. And so the questionnaire would come out, you would fill this out, and you would be rated along these 4 dimensions. Were you the type of person, based upon your responses to this questionnaire, that tended to be more of an extrovert or an introvert, to be someone who's given to making assessments and decisions more upon sensing or upon intuition, upon thinking versus feeling, upon judging versus perception, and these kinds of things. And it was very, very popular in the 80s. I've taken it a number of times, and it can be useful, I think, in some ways to sort of get an understanding of yourself and how you generally behave in many, many different types of circumstances. However, to hard code someone as a particular place, a fixed place in these 4 dimensions, I think is erroneous, especially given the fact that, for instance, on 2 particular days, if you were to take the Myers-Briggs questionnaire on a Monday in the morning and then on Thursday afternoon of the same week, you can end up with 2 significantly different sets of responses. In other words, you end up on one day coming out as a ENTJ or on the next day as an ISFP. And if personality really doesn't change over time, how is it that you end up with 2 different sets of results from the MBTI if you're the same personality? And so I think what we're beginning to see, as you can tell from my take on these tools, is that while they may be useful to some degree, they can hardly be accepted as the definitive assessment of your personality without fail. There is a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of estimation in these attempts to try and assess what someone's personality is. What does this come down to then? I think really what it comes down to is the big question: is it really true that my personality really doesn't change over time? And I would tell you in response to this question, that has really not been my anecdotal experience. I think that for myself and for others, as we grow over time, that our experiences, our perspective, a lot of things cause us to broaden in our understanding and outlook and perspective on life. People's personalities, while they may remain somewhat constant over time, they can change. And many times over the course of a lifetime, when we are forced to experience events or circumstances which are traumatic, which are significant, which really do change our lives in many ways, that sometimes those events can force us to reconsider our perspective, the way we look at things, and over time, our very behavior, in fact, our very personality can change and grow over time. And quite frankly, this is the great hope of all of us, isn't it? That over time we can become better versions of ourselves than we are perhaps today. That we can tend to respond more habitually in the best possible version of ourselves rather than the worst. That's the great hope. I think that helps us to at least begin our understanding of how personality intersects our work life as well as the work life of those whom we will lead as leaders and managers in the world today and in our future. Hope that makes sense. We'll see you in the next lecture.